Well, welcome everyone. I'm so happy to have you here tonight. My name is Joni Parsons. I'm co-creator of Rebel 11 along with Monica Smith. Thank you for joining us. We started Rebel 11, 5 years ago already. And the reason is we wanted to have edgy, informative, and fun events for women and men as well. And we're so happy you're here tonight. You know, why is it that food or meals can transport you back to place? I have found that my whole life, that I can be eating something and it will transport me just back to that one moment in time. Or as my mom used to always say, as we were walking on the pier on the Puget Sound here in Seattle, that smell, Joni, will bring you right back here. Well, Cynthia Nims is all about that. And I'm so happy to have Cynthia here tonight. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here with you, Joni, and all these fabulous people.
Yes, Cynthia is, I think everybody would love to have your job. Cynthia is a writer, but not just a writer. She writes about food and beverage and travel, and who wouldn't love to do that? She is the former food editor for Seattle Magazine. She's written for Sunset Magazine, Cooking Light, Coastal Living, and so many others. And on top of it, she's written 18 cookbooks. 18. And I know more that she's authored for other people as well. But tonight we're here to talk about Shellfish, which is her brand new book, which is coming out in a couple of weeks. So we're getting a preview. So welcome, Cynthia. I'm so pleased to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much, Jenny. I'm thrilled to be here too.
And you're in your kitchen in West Seattle.
I am in my kitchen in West Seattle, yes.
I love that. It's always fun to see the kitchen of a cook and what is important in the background there. I really want to start with a little bit about you, Cynthia, and, really tell us where your love of cooking began.
Well, I would say I think it's true for a number of folks, at least those who were lucky to grow up in a family where there was a lot of cooking and there was a love of cooking. I am one of those who was lucky to grow up with a mom who loved to cook and a sister who loved to cook, who is here with us as well. So we spent a lot of time cooking just, for fun, weekends and trying different things. And, I loved picking up old magazines at garage sales, bringing them home and cooking things. My family was in the Navy. And so as a Navy family, moving around, my mom picked up recipes and ideas from a number of other sort of Navy families traveling. So we had a kind of an eclectic mix of things at home too. So I just naturally picked up a love of food, being around others. I mean, that's where you get it, right? Being around others who love food.
Well, you had an unusual start in that you went to college for mathematics on the road to being an engineer. So, yeah. Engineer, cook,
right.
Author,
I know.
Writer. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, I did always love to cook. We cooked, like I said, cooked a lot at home. I loved to I picked up my mom's love of entertaining. In high school studying French, I really love languages, and I took 3 years of French in high school. And I had my third year, so my senior year, my third year French class, which by that time is a smaller group of people, of course, they came over to my house for dinner. I made like a full-on sort of French meal with French onion soup, and I don't remember what was for dessert and stuff. So I've always loved cooking, but it didn't occur to me that it was going to be a career path. I thought I was fully convinced I was just going to throw really great dinner parties and love having people over, and that was the extent of where I thought cooking and entertaining was going to take me. And I thought, sure, I was going to be an engineer doing all just have these great dinner parties on weekends. But then I took a physics class in college, which, I started to realize that as much as I loved math, I maybe didn't have it really in me for the whole engineering path. And honestly, math, I think it just wasn't going to be my career path. And then I was kind of lost because I did get a math degree. I did also, though, major in French language. And that was kind of my saving grace because we did study abroad. I got to do a couple of study abroad programs. So being in France and you know, that culture that's just, you know, they just live for food, and they live for the, you know, really great meals and really great ingredients and the seasons and being around the table. So I picked up a lot of that in France. I think that's planted a seed. And so after I finished college, I ended up going back to France to study cooking when I realized I wasn't going to be an engineer. In France, ended up staying a couple of years. And that's where really the path of being a professional in the food world rather than just a really devoted home cook started to gel. But it took years. I mean, it was a long while. I was well into my 20s before I really sort of figured that all out.
Well, I'm sure your background in mathematics and having that engineering type of framework in your mind has helped with recipe creation, which is another one of your specialties.
Yeah,
so
I'm kind of a detail freak. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that experience has probably helped quite a bit.
Yeah, and you know, when you have to double or have a recipe, hopefully I can figure out the proportions okay with the math.
Yeah, this PR brain doesn't have that, so I'm glad you have that background. Well, let's talk about your new book. Tell us about Shellfish.
Sure. So this is the new book, Shellfish. Just got my advance copies last week, and it comes out. The official release date is the 15th, so it's next Tuesday. And seafood has been, it's not the only thing I've focused on in my career, but it's been a very constant thread. And in fact, when I came back to Seattle after being in France and going to cooking school, through a serendipitous coffee meeting with someone, I learned about a job that was available. A magazine that was published in Ballard, Simply Seafood magazine, needed a food editor. And I had just come back from cooking school. I didn't know what I was going to do with this new knowledge back in Seattle, where I had, you know, left as a, you know, not an engineering person. I got this job at Simply Seafood magazine, learned the magazine world sort of from the ground up, having not really had experience in it. And it was the most phenomenal job. I loved it so much. So seafood really became a foundational part of my food writing. And again, like I said, I've certainly written about other subjects and done other things over time. But I looped back in recent years. In 2016, I wrote a book. For some reason, I hadn't managed to actually write a book about oysters in all those years, even though it's one of the most sort of quintessential Northwest foods and one of the most, you know, popular shellfish, seafoods in general. And so oysters, and then I did a crab book. They came out both in 2016. And then, and everybody assumed that there was going to be a third book, which you would make sense. 1, 2, 3, you know, things come in threes. And go. I didn't have that in mind until this project came up right at the beginning of the pandemic. I actually got to have a face-to-face meeting with my editor in February of 2020. And it was a project that I worked on through the first year of the pandemic.
That's fantastic. Well, let's start out. I know you're going to cook a recipe for us tonight that everyone should have that I sent out. If not, we can put it in the chat here. But why don't you talk about the recipe? Because I know you need to get that going.
I'm going to get it in the oven.
We'll be talking about other things throughout the next 50 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. And this is a truncated version of the recipe, only just for the sake of time. So, because I wanted to talk about travel and experiencing food in shellfish in different parts of the world and just unique experiences. So the recipe part is a little bit, I jumped ahead a little bit. We're going to have oysters that are baked with horseradish breadcrumbs. So I have shucked 11 of the 12 oysters for that recipe. I have made the breadcrumb mixture, which is some fresh breadcrumbs that I toasted in the oven a little bit, and some horseradish that I grated. Oh, I'm going to move my camera down. Sorry, I forgot that part.
Perfect. That's perfect.
So, so this is a horseradish fresh, peel off the outer skin and then use a nice fine microplane to get a really fine grating, but that's already been mixed in with the breadcrumbs. And as the recipe states, if you don't use the fresh horseradish that you grate, and you're using the horseradish out of a jar, you do the recipe slightly differently, and it's noted there. You're going to put it in with the melted butter because it's a little, it's wetter already, and then add it to the crumbs later. But if you're using the fresh grated horseradish, it goes in with the breadcrumbs. And then about that last oyster, this is how I like to store oysters when I get home from the store, or clams or mussels or anything like that. Put them in a sieve. This is like my elegant, beat up, well-loved colander, and put them in the colander, set it inside a bowl to catch drips, and then put a damp towel on top and keep it in the fridge like that until you're ready to use them.
That's a good tip.
And then here is a oyster. This one, I believe, is from Willapa Bay, so it's southern part of Washington.
And Cynthia, for those people who are here in Seattle, where did you get those?
Well, I happen to get these just at my neighborhood thriftway here in West Seattle. Generally, some of my favorite places, well, and a lot of stores have great, like a Met Market tends to have some good oyster options. I love going to Wajimaya or Mutual Fish, where get larger selections of oysters. If you want to get a variety, or you just want to be able to pick from different types, you can go to, those are my two favorites. But then there's others in other parts of Seattle in the North End, or those just happen to be convenient for me from here.
Great. Okay.
I'm just going to do a quick shuck. I was going to say I could do like a whole 2-hour thing just on oysters, but I'm going to try to not go too far deep. But this is just a straight through shucking demo. The cup side, the oysters are going to have a rounder bottom and a flatter top. So you start with the cup side down, get a nice heavy dish towel that you fold over to make it good and thick. There's a pointier, you can see it's sort of rounded, and then it has a slightly pointier edge. Not every oyster makes it super easy to figure out which end is the pointiest, but that's where the hinge is, and you're going to put the oyster knife tip in there. This is one of my favorite oyster knives. It's got a textured handle, which is super important. So if your hands get a little wet, which often happens if you're shucking a bunch of oysters, you still have a nice grip. It's got a super sturdy blade made very much for this purpose. So don't be tempted to do this with like a little paring knife or anything. So,
yeah, not a good idea.
Yeah, just don't do it. Just don't do it. So then cover the oyster, leaving this little hinge part exposed. Use the tip of your knife. Can you see that all right? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
So use the tip of your knife to supposedly very gently, there we go. Just if you get the tip in enough that you can hold the oyster up, I mean, you know that you've got at least a little bit of clearance through the shell. And then what you do is you twist. Whoops, you don't do that. Don't do that. That's definitely not the first choice, is to have the blade go all the way in, but that still happens. Try to have the blade tip go in. And then what you do is you turn the handle so it pries the shell open. And then there's a muscle that's holding the shells together. You take the knife flat against the top and scrape to get the top muscle disconnected. And then,
oh, that's perfect.
And then that muscle right there is also attaching on the bottom. So if you're, well, you pretty much always want to get the oyster out of the shell completely. So you then run the tip of the knife underneath. And there you go. So that's a shucked oyster. And
that is beautiful.
Oh, there you go. Thanks. And I'm just going to add this to my tray. Which magically,
I know that that's just such a fancy thing to be able to do well, and I have not endeavored to do that yet. I let my partner do it.
It's not super complicated, but it definitely takes some comfort getting used to the motion and what you're trying to accomplish, and careful about the shells and the knife and stuff. So these are going to be baked. So they're on a baking sheet. And what I've done here is take a large piece of foil. You cut it about double the length of your baking sheet, and you crunch it up, and it creates some texture on which The oysters are going to sit a little more steadily because, you know, they have rounded bottoms and often will wobble around. But this is just a little trick to create sort of a flatter setting. And I've got I told you I had my breadcrumbs, and the horseradish is already. Here's some yummy melted butter, because what's life without some melted butter or oysters, seafood? Goes beautifully together.
Is everybody getting hungry?
Yeah. I wish I could just put oysters in the chat for everybody. That would be fun.
Well, yeah, I think we'd all like to be in your kitchen with you right now, Cynthia.
So I'm just tossing these up enough to evenly moisten the crumbs. And then it's just a matter of plopping. Plopping is a very, very technical culinary term. Putting some of the crumbs on each. Oh, I forgot to put salt in, but you guys will forgive me, right?
Yes.
The recipe, you'll know when you do it. And when you're shucking oysters, sometimes they will have quite a lot of liquor, the liquid, you know, you see around the edge of the oyster in its shell. And when you're slurping those oysters raw, that liquor is wonderful. I mean, it's sort of like a natural, not sauce, like mignonette. You know, some people like to put lemon juice on oysters. Others, the purists, really just love that liquor. That is just sort of the natural seawater that came with the oyster. But in the case of baking, when you're doing something like this, that water or that liquid is gonna, you know, make soggier crumbs. So when I'm doing a recipe like this, I tend to pour off a little bit. If there's a whole lot of liquid, I pour it off just so, you know, again, the crumbs aren't gonna be too nice. That's all ready to go. I'm just gonna pop it in the oven. It's 400 degrees for 10 minutes.
So for just 10 minutes, that's great.
Yeah, that's, yeah, the recipe says, I think the recipe says 8 to 10, you know, as with all things. It's a matter of looking at the oysters. You're looking for it to be a little bubbly around the edges, the liquids, and the crumbs being browned, nicely browned.
And what would you serve that with?
Well, this, it can be either sort of an appetizer as is, like a first course. You could have 2 or 3 of these on a plate, or you could, if you want to have, you know, 10 or 12, or, you know, 8 to 12, depending on your appetite, for a main, you know, I would say just a really good salad, like a slaw, maybe, and maybe some roasted potatoes or something to make a more substantial meal. And if it's a first course, you could still have like a little bright, like an arugula salad or something. It's kind of rich. Nice. And so I think something crisp and bright alongside would be great.
Lovely.
So, so that's in the oven for about 10 minutes. I'm just going to pull it out and I'll show you the finished results a little bit later. But one of the things that I love about seafood in general, and obviously I'm currently talking about shellfish, is how compelling it is when you travel to encounter, you know, shellfish that aren't available at home. Granted, I mean, we can buy lobster in Seattle. It's not like shellfish doesn't travel. It does, and we do have a lot available to us in, you know, whatever part of the world we're in. But I think there's a lot to be said about exploring regional, distinctive, unique shellfish when you are traveling, because the varieties are so different all over the world. Crab, you know, you've got Dungeness crab here on our coast, you've got blue crab on the East Coast, you've got different crab that are in Europe and other crabs still that are in, so that's even just one shellfish, you know, you've got a range of different flavor and texture experiences, and also the cultures there prepare them differently. So it's just such an eye-opening, delicious, culturally compelling, you know, interesting thing to do. I think when I travel is to keep an eye out for seafood and shellfish in particular. So I put together just this super simple little taste kind of some of the more memorable experiences I've had with shellfish on the road.
Wonderful. And you just got back from Paris, so I have a little bit.
I forgot to mention that. I just got back from Paris on Sunday. So I did throw in a couple of more images from that.
Great.
All right, so now oh, there we go. Okay, so this is just random things that I've come across in travels. The top left, these teeny weeny little clams are called télines, and we were in the south of France, and we were at, I don't want to say random. Every time I say random, I feel like it's underselling the place, but it was not a fancy restaurant. It was just a neighborhood restaurant in this little village. And how could we pass up? Although I was going to say, how could we pass up trying them? But you can see how small they are. It took like eating 100 of them to have half a serving or whatever, but it was super fun to see that. I think those crazy crab are in Spain maybe, and beautiful scallops shucked on the half shell. We don't see them on the half shell in the States too often. Some specialty carry them, but you'll see they have the roe, and they're ready to go home and have someone probably gratiner them in the oven or something. Bottom left is some shellfish that were in the market in Venice. I don't even know what those crazy things are on the right, but there's some family, but in the shrimp and or lobster langoustine kind of product. Some sweet little cockles. I think that's in Spain or Portugal. And then on the right bottom is this goofy, crazy thing. I don't know if anybody's seen those before. They're called Gooseneck Barnacles. They're actually around here in the Northwest too, but that was at a restaurant in Lisbon. And it's just like,
Cynthia, are they good? They don't look good.
They are good. They're kind of, they have this really weird leathery outside, and they do look alien and very unpleasant, but you take that that leathery sort of skin off, and underneath it's sweet like a clam. It's not unlike other shellfish, like the bivalve kind of type family. It's different. It's not strong or anything. I think if you already like shellfish, it's the kind of thing that's worth trying.
It's worth trying. Okay.
Worth trying, yeah.
Great.
So now for something completely different. Kodiak Island. So when I was at Simply Seafood magazine, this was in the 90s, I had a week up on Kodiak Island in Alaska. And we were actually, the point of the story was being with salmon fishing families and spending time with them and learning more about salmon fishing. And this was a teeny weeny little village on the south end of the island. Oh, if there were a couple of hundred inhabitants that lived there year round, I'd be surprised, maybe 200 or 300. It was very small, but more people come in for the summertime to do the summer salmon fishing. And they threw a potluck for me and this other writer that were up there. And it was one of the most extraordinary meals because it was, well, 9/10 of it was salmon, of course, which is totally fine, happy with that. And, local foods they'd been, they grew. It was a very, very local meal. And then these folks have king crab pots, and we went out on, and picked up some king crab right out of the water, and you can see they went in a basket, and they were cooked literally right there in the water with seawater in these big, huge pots. And can you get over that big Tupperware bowl full of freshly cooked king crab legs?
That just looks amazing.
It was so amazing. It was such a unique and wonderful experience, and definitely a taste of place because, the crab were pulled up right there. It's representative of, who knows, countless generations of subsistence fishing, the way people have lived there for so long. And, of course, it has, grown to be a commercially important product too, along with the salmon. That was just a mind-blowing week, as you might imagine. And it's kind of hard to, I do have king crab legs down here like everybody else, but I will, it's so hard to have a king crab leg on a buffet or whatever, or, even in a restaurant and not wish I was on Kodiak Island.
Going back to place, it takes you right back there, I bet.
Yes, exactly. And I don't know if folks have seen them occasionally. These are these are big crabs. So to have them in a live tank anywhere, you know, like even at a sea market, it's very rare in my experience to see them live in tanks. But you will occasionally see them in Asian restaurants in tanks where they will, you know, pull one out as upon order, and
not quite the same as being in
right
Alaska.
Sorry?
Not quite the same as being in
Not
Alaska.
quite the same. It's at least a step up from, you know, the frozen lake. So it's a fun splurge. I did that. There's a restaurant, I believe it's still open. It's so hard to know these days. Sun Sui Wa is an Asian restaurant up in Vancouver that I've been to a few times and had that live crab. So it's a splurge to consider if you can't get to Kodiak Island for your king crab.
Yeah. So Cynthia, somebody asked if it's dangerous or difficult to hold a crab that size.
Well, I did okay, I guess. I mean, I probably didn't hold it for all that long. It does have claws down there, but I don't think they were, you know, those claw arms are a little bit shorter than the legs. The other legs are longer than the claws. So I think that sort of made it a little bit easier to manage. But the thing about king crab, if you haven't, even when you buy them, you know, frozen or whatever and cook them at home, those shells have spikes that are super duper sharp. So you do have to be super careful when you're handling them, because they're you can definitely sort of accidentally puncture yourself. So even the shell alone, let alone, you know, the live claws, but that wasn't too bad, that particular experience.
Okay.
Let me see where we're going next.
And I just want to be mindful of time as far as your 10 minutes go.
I got 10 minutes? Okay.
I mean, no,
I got a timer.
For your,
I've got it.
No, you've got plenty of time. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, thanks. So next, here we are in Paris.
Yay!
There's my, oh yeah, they look good. So I'm just going to take these out and I'll show you in a minute when we're done with the slides.
Okay, perfect.
And I'm super sorry you can't have any.
I am too, to be quite honest with you, and everybody else on the Zoom tonight.
So Paris is not a coastal town, as you might be aware, but there's this neighborhood called Montparnasse, which is sort of northwest-ish, and there's a big major train station there, and the trains that go to Montparnasse come from northwest France. You know, throughout Paris, there are different the train stations, you know, sort of point you in different directions. And so in Brittany is where a lot of France's oysters come from. So for however long the train system's been going, it's been possible to have incredibly fresh oysters and other seafood especially in the Montparnasse area. But once it gets to Paris, you know, it goes to the other neighborhoods too. So so this is kind of why there's this culture of seafood, particularly again around this Montparnasse. And this place, Le Dôme, I failed to look up how long it's been there, but it's been a long time. It's well over 100 years. It is, you know, one of the celebrated cafes of, you know, Gertrude Stein and Hemingway and many others. And it has become a favorite spot. I think I probably go almost every trip. This picture in the corner is of me and a friend from 5 years ago. It's not from this specific trip last week, but we did go back. And it's just so delightful. You'll see that classic presentation of the raised tray with the plateau. They call them plateau de fruits de mer. And it's got seaweed on it, and there's ice under the seaweed. And under the, you know, underneath the plateau is invariably the classic triad of some bread, usually some dark bread, rye, butter for the bread, and lemon, as you'll see. So that's a super classic presentation. Below that, the other plateau is from last week. We went to a restaurant in a different part of town called Beaufinger. It looks like Bowfinger, but of course it is.
Of course it's not.
Pronounced Beaufinger. And in this case, we did get a mix. So you'll see there's some oysters. The little dish at the bottom is these small shrimp called crevette grise, or gray shrimp, little gray shrimp. And then it's, unfortunately, it's not really easy to make out what that other thing is, but it's half of a crab. They call tourteau. And it's kind of, it's a little stocky. You can, I don't know if you can kind of, with that claw almost looks a little bit like a stone crab claw, but the rest of the legs are kind of spindly. And my friend I was with, who's native Northwester as well, we're like, too much work. It's not as good as Dungeness. You know, of course we ate it and it was delightful, but that's, you know, it's fun to.
And we're a little spoiled here in the Pacific West.
but that's just such a joy. And then the little shrimp are, they were just sweet and delicious. And they have a homemade mayonnaise on the tray there, which was to sort of dab the shrimp in. So that was a big treat. And then on the left, I mean, my eyes just always get attracted to seafood markets. So we're on a random street in the Marais. It's not even the fanciest fish market by any stretch, but this is just a display that you'll see. And so it's so intriguing. You'll see, I don't know if you can really not make it out necessarily, but there's the little teeny crevette grise. Those blobby things next in sort of the upper left quadrant are sea urchins. You've got whelks, the sort of almost snail-like looking thing, and langoustine and shrimp. Anyway, it's so engaging, I think, just to see all these different types of seafood and get a sense of what you'll probably have access to or be able to try in the restaurants when you're out dining. This is one reason it's nice to have an apartment when you're traveling, so you can buy things at the market, buy things at the shop to enjoy and play around with, or just let the chefs there do it for you.
Yeah, that sounds good too. I just wanted to ask you a quick question. I don't think of shrimp and mayo together. Is that strictly French?
Oh, I don't know. Shrimp salad is shrimp and mayo. I don't know.
I just don't think of it. I guess I don't put mayo on my shrimp. maybe I'm unusual, but
well, and it's optional too. You could certainly have them plain. I think in France, we think of mayonnaise as a condiment, as something that you mix into things to bind things, or spread on a sandwich or something. But it's a little bit more of a traditional sauce, especially when it's homemade and it's very good. It's really great, sort of rich, eggy flavor. It's used a little bit more as a component like that, rather than just as what am I trying to say? Like a condiment that you're mixing.
Okay.
Something with.
I had to ask.
But that's the point of travel, and just learning all this stuff and trying other things.
Everyone, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and we'll just make this little conversation as we're going through all these lovely places that we're traveling to. So what do you have next there, Cynthia?
Sure. Yeah, well, and I was just going to say the plat de cancale in the middle in that basket, that's from a seafood market somewhere. And also even in the fresh markets, like the weekly markets, the produce markets, and that pop up in different neighborhoods around Paris, there's often going to be a vendor that has oysters to buy and take home. And so these are a flat oyster. The flat round oysters are traditional they're more common in Europe. They're not native to the States as much, or North America. So that's another treat to enjoy there is those flat oysters. And Cancale is one of the cities in Brittany where those will have come from. So now we're going somewhere completely different. We're going to South Carolina. This was a trip with, I think it was two other couples. We had a home, that we had rented for a week, and we were exploring Charleston. None of us had ever been there. And this is this is one of the weirdest and most enlightening sort of travel tips I picked up on that trip. So the three of us went out and got pedicures, as one does on vacation, right? One of the first things we do, drop our stuff at the house, go get some pedicures, and we're sitting there not minding our own business, but we're yakking about our trip. And there's some lovely local ladies next to us, and we start yakking. Oh, and it doesn't hurt that I'm with Kathy Casey, so she's along for the ride too. So we're like all about.
Can you explain Kathy Casey for those that aren't from the Pacific Northwest?
Kathy Casey, oh gosh, she's a dynamo. She was one of the first female chefs in sort of a large fine dining in Seattle at Fuller's Restaurant.
Fuller's, yeah.
People don't, may not know because it's been long gone. She's a phenomenal chef, restaurateur. She has restaurants at the airport people are familiar with, Dish Delish and Lucky Louie. And
it's just a very well-known Seattle.
Very well-known, yeah. And she's a consultant and does all sorts of fabulous stuff. And is a great travel partner, I can tell you. So these women, so we talked about shrimp, and long story short, the women told us where to go get shrimp. So instead of like trying to find a seafood market or going to the grocery store to get shrimp, which are very associated with South Carolina, we learned to go to this place called Shem Creek, which is where that fishing boat is that you see in that one image, which is, so it's an area where shrimpers are based, kind of like if you went to Fisherman's Terminal in Seattle, where the fishing boats are based, and you can sometimes buy things directly from them. So we got that tip, and we went to Shem Creek that day or the next day or something, and found that, they didn't have fresh shrimp that day, but the guy got our phone number and called us a couple days later and said the shrimp are in. So we went and got, like, I don't remember, 8 pounds or something, I don't know. And then it happened to be, we also went to the farmer's market. So we picked up, you can see like new potatoes and corn and sweet onions and all sorts of yummy stuff. And we just simply, let's see, there's herbs, there's green onion, there's lemon. We just put the shrimp in this big pot, steamed them. And that meal on that plate, and we're out on the back patio, the sunset's absolutely perfect. Kathy's making cocktails, and it was one of those mind-blowingly perfect nights. We just had the best time, the best meal, very local, bought from the fishermen that morning. We can't replicate it really. I mean, we can at the store and do something similar, but it's not gonna taste or feel or, it's not going to be quite as evocative.
It's the place and the moment in time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so I've got to tell you.
No, go ahead.
So you can see we made yummy garlic bread, because garlic bread. I forget about garlic bread, and then I'm like, why don't we make garlic bread more often? Because it's so delicious. So we actually bought more shrimp than we could eat, which is hard to believe because I feel like we ate a lot of shrimp that night, and we had leftover garlic bread. So what we did the next day is make the world's best shrimp salad sandwich with the leftover shrimp that we chopped up. And then this is a super duper important pro tip, is to save your shrimp shells, and you can make stock with them.
Mm.
We made a shrimp stock with the shells, reduced that down so it got really nice and thick and flavorful, and added that to the shrimp with a little mayo. And then we ate it on leftover garlic bread. Oh.
That sounds amazing.
It was amazing.
That sounds amazing.
So
so for the shrimp shells, you just stick those in the freezer, and how long will they last?
Or you just use them right away, but you can definitely accumulate them in the freezer, which is not a bad idea if you're peeling like 1 pound of shrimp at a time or something. I would say I wouldn't store them more than a month or two. They're fine and delicate and thin, and I just don't know that they're going to hold their flavor all that well. You can technically leave them in the freezer for a long time, but I just don't know the flavor is going to be that great. So but it is a really great idea to collect. So obviously for the Shellfish book, I was also collecting crab and lobster shells. You can use them all together. You can use just shrimp, and there is nothing better than, like, if you make a chowder with sort of average fish stock or something you bought at the store, or water or whatever, which is totally great. But then you make it with some shellfish stock that you've had in the freezer. The flavor difference is really pronounced, in the depth and character it's going to have is very much worth making a big pot. And the nice thing is, if you do make a big pot, you can freeze it in a bunch of smaller quart bags, and you've got it to use for a lot of different recipes over time, and you'll be thrilled to death when you can just go downstairs, pull that up, make the world's best risotto
That sounds great.
Yeah, so that's a really nice sort of, it's getting extra use out of the seafood because it is expensive. There's no way around the fact that these things are expensive. So it's nice, or they can be expensive depending on the time of year and what variety and all that. So you get the most out of your shopping dollar.
So where are we going next?
Now, this is the last of them. We are in Virginia. We had a family wedding in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I may have stepped foot in Virginia prior to that, but we really hadn't explored the state much. So my husband and I added some extra time. We went to the eastern shore of Virginia, which is like a peninsula of sorts that has the Chesapeake on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other. And we just I found a VRBO that we rented for, I don't remember how many days. And this is just the craziest thing. I'm communicating with this woman who's in the picture in the middle about our stay. Her description had mentioned that we have a little dock where you can fish blue crab. And I'm like, well, that's right up my alley. I mean, I'm literally, stuff like this is on my radar all the time when I'm traveling. So to have that little extra nudge of, oh, there's an interesting seafood experience I can have. So we're chatting in the, by email before I went, and she's like, is this Cynthia Nims? And did you used to work at Simply Seafood magazine?
Oh, really?
And I'm like,
I love that.
yes. And so this woman owned a really cool specialty food company called the Blue Crab Bay Company, or Blue Crab Bay Company. And they weren't crab products, but they were sort of things that went well with crab, like seasoning mixes and actually spiced nuts and various things, but they were all sea themed and sea sort of oriented. And it was the craziest thing. So like 20 years later, out of the blue, of all the VRBOs I could pick on Eastern Shore, it ends up being Pamela. And so we cooked up this crazy idea, because of course I'm giving him a hard time about blue crab. You know, they're small, they're a lot of work, they don't taste quite as good as Dungeness, in a friendly way.
It
right?
all goes back to Dungeness crab, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually I'd seen an article where a chef from Baltimore had said in print in a newspaper that Dungeness does not rate. And I'm like, what? So anyway, I had my hackles all up and everything. So we decided to have this little crab off that we concocted. So the blue crab were literally caught. You can see barely behind her. That's a little inlet off of the Chesapeake. So those were caught right there. And I had these crabs shipped over from Mutual Fish, one of the places I mentioned there on Rainier Avenue South, third generation seafood market. And so we had this lovely afternoon. The food writer from the Virginia Pilot newspaper was there. So we just ate a bunch of crab and talked about, you know, like the cultural, like how do you eat them, and you know, how do you serve them, and that kind of thing. And it was just super fun. And we each wrote articles about it, about these.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah.
So Cynthia, somebody asked in the chat, do basic looking shrimp, so just a basic shrimp, actually taste different in different areas?
That's a really interesting question.
It is an interesting question.
Yeah, and actually it goes back to something I meant to say about 45 minutes ago, which is this idea of the taste of place, talking about being somewhere and eating something that's associated with that place. But the other more sort of technical aspect of that is when a seafood literally takes on the taste of the place where it grew. And it's a term some may have heard before, merroir, which is the sea version of terroir. So,
terroir of wine, right?
Yeah, it's terroir of wine. And it's particularly associated with oysters, because oysters are filter feeders. Those two shells that we popped open earlier, you know, they will open those shells, they draw water throughout the day, and they collect their nutrition from the phytoplankton and zooplankton and other nutritive elements that are in the water. And in doing that, they are taking on, maybe a little more mineral character if depending on sort of the rocks in the area that they are, or the brininess if the water's a little saltier, or whatever. I mean, there's a lot. I don't have a palate that can pick up, all of those distinctions, as I really can't all that well with wine either. But I think with
some people can.
Yeah,
Sure,
yeah,
right?
no, for sure. So it's particularly noticeable in oysters when they're raw. I think as soon as they're cooked, you can imagine that the finesse of
Mhm.
might be it's a little less pronounced, or maybe a lot less pronounced. But and I think it's mostly noticeable when, and that would be the same, I think, for other foods. I'm not a raw clam eater, but people who grew up on the East Coast, they eat raw clams a lot. So I'm sure it's exactly the same with clams. As for shrimp, I think probably in very high levels. I mean, like a shrimp from, I don't know. I don't know if a shrimp from the Gulf of Mexico is going to taste wildly different from the same species of shrimp harvested in North Carolina or South Carolina. I haven't done side by side. And again, most often they're going to be cooked. But there are probably, certainly subtle, maybe sometimes less subtle differences between species. Spot prawns tend to be a little sweeter, maybe. Others are lighter flavor. So I haven't had an experience with shrimp where I've had them side by side and noticed a specific distinction, but I can see it being possible.
Well, so speaking of cooked oysters, let's go back to your pan of oysters so we can see them now.
Yeah, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, wonderful.
And here, oops, well, you can't see them yet.
Oh, those look so good. Can you smell them, everyone? I feel like I can. It's just wafting.
I'm very sorry. I know it's kind of
delicious.
I know it's kind of mean.
It is kind of mean. It is kind of mean. Yeah.
I was going to mention one. I know we're going to move on to questions in a second. But I was going to mention one interesting thing or quirky thing or whatever about eating oysters in France, or at least in Paris for sure, is, I know for folks who are used to slurping oysters in the States, we get an oyster on the half shell and we can just slurp it right away because, as I showed earlier, you cut the muscle at the top and then you also cut the muscle at the bottom that disconnects the oyster from the bottom shell. In Paris, they don't do that. They don't cut the bottom shell. So you can you're just not going to be able to slurp it. You've got to separate it.
You've got to do it yourself.
And so these are, this is a little oyster fork. I just bought a bunch of these in Paris just now. They don't really have they don't have a sharp edge at all, but basically you just use the edge of the fork to dislodge that. And it's not nearly as tidy as if you were able to do it with an oyster knife, but it's just it's an interesting thing. If you're not prepared for it, when you go to slurp, you're going to wonder why the oyster won't come out. So you definitely need to use a tool to get at them there.
Nice. And then, okay, so anything else about the oysters that you have right there?
Nothing in particular, I guess, except, I mean, again, you could put a nickel in me and I could talk about oysters for another hour, but I would say one thing is that these are the Pacific variety of oysters. So they're the most sort of prolific variety that's grown on the West Coast. It's not native. It came over from Japan in sort of the 1920s, 30s, but took obviously very, very well. And you'll almost never see an oyster on a menu or in a seafood market that's just called Pacific oyster. They always have a place name, usually, sometimes a branded name, like a Hama Hama oyster is Hama. Well, that's also kind of a place name because there's a river there. Anyway,
right.
Chelsea gems are an oyster from around Olympia. That's the Pacific as well. So these are Elkhorn, I think was the name. Not one I was familiar with by name, but there's hundreds of different names that an oyster might take.
They're so good. Exactly. And somebody was mentioning that how nice those, can you just hold one up closer to the camera just so we can see it a little bit closer? There we go. delicious. So you can still see how you would just pull that out, and you would eat this in a couple of different bites, right?
Not me.
Not you? Okay.
Well, I suppose it depends on how big the oyster is. I guess some of these are kind of small enough to be one. Oh, and that's, I suppose, another thing. When you're baking or grilling an oyster, cooking them in the shell like this, it's not the time to spend to get fancy little kushi oysters or little shigoku, the elegant little oysters that are or Kumamoto's. They're really at their best slurped raw, and they're small anyway. So
little.
So you wouldn't and they contract a little bit as they cook. So by the time you cook those little guys, they'll just be teeny little nipples, which is totally fine if you want to do sort of a fancy, cocktail party version of a baked oyster. But generally, when you're going to cook them, again, either in the oven or on the grill, you do want to go for larger oysters that are 3, maybe 4 inches. And sometimes I have seen them sometimes just called baker oysters or grilling oysters. And then in that case, they sometimes don't have a place name because they're just the large oysters that are ideal for those other options.
Well, Cynthia, I can't wait to get your book. And as she mentioned at the beginning of the program, it's coming out next week. And we're super lucky because somebody in the audience that's joining us tonight is getting one. And Natalia, who is doing our tech work, has pulled somebody's name out of the hat, and it's Norma. So Norma, congratulations. We will be sending you the book out next week, and we're so happy that you joined us this evening. I'll get your information shortly. But we've got some exciting news, and Cynthia and I are going to be doing a retreat in May. And Cynthia, why don't you talk to us about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I am just thrilled to death, Joni, that you want to do
Me too.
So we love being together cooking. I think, people just love being in the kitchen. They love being around food. They love having that chance to sort of share not only the meal at the table, but the prep of it so often, even if they're just someone sort of leaning against the counter with a glass of wine and maybe
absolutely
one branch of celery, but people love to be around cooking food. So we're going to do nothing but not nothing, but we're going to do other things too, but we're going to cook together for a weekend. And one evening is going to be recipes from the Shellfish book, and it'll include, a little more like, hands-on with the oyster shucking and, how to clean and prep a crab. And then we're going to cook together. We're literally going to be making our dinner and using recipes from the Shellfish book. So that'll be really fun. And then the next evening, I don't have a copy of it handy, but I could go run and get one. But we're going to a completely other love of mine, which is game night, playing games, board games, unplugging, playing games. So I wrote a book, it's been a while, I don't remember, 10 years ago or something, called Gourmet Game Night. And the premise is that it's all foods that you can enjoy while you're playing games. So they're smaller, they're like, you don't need a knife and a fork. You're eating things on a skewer, or you're eating things out of a demitasse cup or something, but it's all a substantial, wonderful dinner party that you can enjoy while playing games. So we're going to literally play games and have a good
and we're going to be going to the farmers market, and we'll be doing a little bit of walking, so we get outside so we can walk off some of the food that we're going to eat. One thing that I enjoy so much about Cynthia is the way that she talks about food, and I'm sure all of you have enjoyed so much this evening, just the enthusiasm and the language around what we eat, how we are together. And Cynthia, I'm just so looking forward to our time together. It's going to be in Roslyn. We have a place over there. It's only 7 people, so it will be a very small group. And if you want to join us, there's more information on rebel11.com. I can't thank you enough, Cynthia, for joining us tonight. I'm just I just love being with you. I love hearing how you talk about place and the things in those places, and we're so lucky to live here in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh my gosh, so lucky.
Yeah. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us. I did have a couple of just kind of roundabout questions that I wanted to end with, and we'll just do it really quickly. What's your favorite food?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Oh, golly. Oh, I thought you, sorry, I thought this was like for the group. Oh,
No, for you.
Crab. I'm just going to say Dungeness crab. Love it.
Okay. What's your favorite place in the world to eat?
Paris?
Okay, great, because you were just there. What are you reading right now?
I am reading something I picked up in a used bookstore. It is from Gourmet magazine. They collected essays written about Paris over the 60 years of Gourmet magazine's life. And so it's a whole, like from the 20s through
Fun.
like 2008 or whatever. So I'm reading all these really great essays about, I'm clearly in a French state of mind.
Yes, you are in a French state of mind, which is not a bad place to be.
Yeah.
And since yesterday was International Women's Day, who is a woman that you admire and why?
Oh gosh. I go back to Kathy Casey. I love her. She's a powerhouse. People who are, I love being around people who are confident and know what they want to accomplish and find a way to make it happen. I find that so inspiring. So, and there's a lot of women in my life that do things, that sort of, accomplish that. And I just always learn from them. And she's one of mine.
She's fabulous. And speaking of another chef that you actually cooked for was Julia Childs. So can you just tell us quickly what that was like in 30 seconds or less?
Yeah. Well, when I was at cooking school, she came to visit because the owner of the cooking school, Ann Willen, they were friends and colleagues from way back. So Julia happened to be there for dinner, and some of us former students that were in the area, we each cooked a different course. It's not like I personally made her dinner, but we all contributed to this dinner and got to sit around the table and enjoy it with her.
Oh my gosh, what a treat.
A phenomenal experience.
Yes. Well, thank you for that wrap.
Yeah.